I would like to introduce the cruïnn, which is a new all-analogue stereo oscillator from Instruō. It's a pretty fun module to patch with. The module itself is 14 HP and it ships with a 4 HP additional passive expander, which breaks out parallel sawtooth outputs as well as adding CV inputs. Yeah, there's a lot of complexity under the hood in terms of the circuitry and implementation of the oscillator itself, but in practice I managed to boil things down to a few key parameters that add a lot of versatility. So it'd be that super saws or something a bit more sophisticated like this through 0 FM cross patching and complex wave shaping. A lot of fun patch examples to dive into, so yeah, I hope you enjoy. Cheers. Okay, let's dive into the cruïnn and listen to some sawtooth waves. So I'm gonna just patch up some things as I go, just so that we can see and hear what's going on in the context as I'm muddling through and describing what's going on. Yeah, in some ways I tried to keep the interface somewhat simplistic and you know, very easy to work with, but under the hood there's quite a lot going on. So fundamentally the cruïnn is a sawtooth wave, a single sawtooth wave core, but to create the stereo output and the super sawing phasing effect, I've essentially cloned the sawtooth wave 5 times. So this top output is the non-phased version, that's clocking the scope, and then we've got 5 phase variants of the fundamental sawtooth. So if we view this one on the red channel, you'll see that phase shifting in relation to the fundamental green. So each of these phase variants, they've got the ability to shift up to 720 degrees of phase. So the default being 360 forward, which is the 0th point, so it means that we can pull it back 360 degrees or push it forward 360 degrees. And when these are moving dynamically, like this pairing, so we can actually see, should be able to see the line alignment of its particular phase variant in this sigma output. So sigma is the sum of left and right, so we've essentially got a monophonic 6 sawtooth layered voice. Cool. Okay, so the orientation of sawtooths per left and right, we've got the unphased output and then 2 phase variants, and they're applied to the top output, which is the right output. And then we've got the last 3 phase variants, which are curated to the left output, which is in the bottom here, left and right. Depends how you patch it. At the core, there's a fundamental sawtooth per left and right channel. On the top one, we have the non-phased version, and then this middle phase variant. This is the sort of foundation for the left output, the lower output. And it's modulating at the lowest rate out of the 5 combinations. So we've got fundamental unphasing and then 2 phase variants. We've then got the slowly phase offset one as a foundation and then 2 phase variants. if we view this one, you can see it looks almost static unless I bring the rate of modulation all the way up, at which point it will start to shift more noticeably, but the other pairs of phase variants move at a faster overall rate. So control of phase, that's coming from this point here, where we've got a display quite reminiscent of the oct. So it's a very similar implementation of triangle wave LFOs, but at much more curated combinations of rates. So the center LFO, center channel, this is the one that's controlling this current red sawtooth, which is the foundation for the left channel. If I max out the rate, we can see that's now oscillating at a maximum of about 1 Hz, whereas the two other pairs, we've got roughly 100 Hz at its maximum. One below that is about 75 Hz, and we've got 100 Hz at that very bottom one and about 75 Hz there. So we have unphased, slow phased. This will then be 100 Hz maximum, 75 Hz maximum, 75 Hz maximum, 100 Hz maximum. And the depth control controls 5 parallel VCAs internally, which control the depth of the triangle LFO modulation over the phase. A nice musical sweet spot is hard left on rate, hard right on depth, especially in lower, like bass note ranges. Starts to sound pretty good. I'm going to patch this through a filter just so we're hearing it in a bit more of a musical context. Okay, cool. So that's what's going on under the hood of the cruïnn. I'll take this red scope line out for a bit. Let's look at the control scheme. So at the bottom here we've got coarse frequency, fine frequency. Similar range of frequencies as my other oscillators. An LFO switch, so that will drop everything down to sub-audio ranges. Volt per octave. And FM CV input, so that's got an attenuator, and you can choose whether it's linear FM or exponential FM. I'll skip over these and let's look at the top. So the top is a built-in VCA, which is actually curated as a stereo VCA, so it's controlling both left and right together. The sigma output is just a sum of left and right, so it of course is VCA'd as well. We've got CV input, attenuator over that, and then the bias level. What you'll probably notice compared to the green raw unphasing sawtooth is there's a bit of non-linearity to peaks of this combined output. This is by design, and it's kind of a necessity given the setup of the module. So I'll bring depth all the way down, and we can see this as a combined parallel phase layer of 6 sawtooth waves. If I bring the amplitude of the VCA down quite low, then we see we've got a proper linear sawtooth shape. So it's got the ability to go into quite traditional territories. So if we imagine what's happening with layered sawtooth waves, if the standard peak-to-peak amplitude is going to be ballpark about 10 volts, so plus or minus 5 volts, 10 volts peak-to-peak. If we do that times 6, or even just times 2, layer up 2 sawtooth waves, we're just summing the amplitudes, so we end up with minus 5 to positive 5 times 2, so we end up with minus 10 to positive 10. So we've now got a 20 volts peak-to-peak sawtooth wave, which is pretty loud. That's still within the power rail ranges of a Eurorack power supply, which is a minus 12 to positive 12, so we're kind of getting up there, but it should theoretically be producible. It would just be very loud. Add a third sawtooth, that's us pushed into 30 volts peak to peak, and times that by 2, and we're now at 6. 6 times 10 volts peak to peak, so we're now at 60 volts peak to peak, which is 60 volts is too many volts. That's too high an amplitude. So that's just going to hard clip when it gets beyond the scope of the output buffers and voltage rails of the power system itself. So this is what I did to get around that. I've implemented a soft clipping circuit that, as it approaches its maximum, it's you can see there's some heavy saturation, some aggressive wave shaping going on, but that's a 60 volts peak to peak signal being soft clipped at an analog limiter. The result being, if I bring up my depth of modulation, so I'm now splitting off the phases of these layered sawtooth waves, we go from phase alignment, maxed out amplitude, to a more random distribution of layering of these sawtooths. So as sawtooths like land in phase, we'll have double ups and peaks, so that's where the wave shaping is starting to come in, but it's never going to hard clip in this context because of the limiter. So shape-wise, it's probably quite familiar to anyone that's played with the tan-H module before. That sort of classic S-curve tangential distortion shaping. I've somehow managed to avoid having a tan-H in this system, but we've got an equivalent. So if I pull out of the second low pass of this 1047, we'll be able to view the limiter's effect, which is effectively just a tan-H on the input signal here. So as I bring up the amplitude, you can see even when we've got linear shaping on the yellow, which is the sigma unison output of the 6 sawtooth waves layered up, there's always a degree of tangential distortion coming from a tan-H. So regardless of amplitude, it's always going to have some wave shaping applied. So that comes through the nature of the circuit, which in tan-H's case is a pair of transistors. In the cruïnn, I'm using Zener diodes as my limiting components, so that stays more linear over a much wider range, which keeps things a bit more traditional for sawtooth waves. Cool. Let's remove that just now. Let's break this out and go stereo. So I've now got the left output in here. I'll make that the right output. Why not? Left we'll have in red. And we're now listening to 3 sawtooth waves from this top channel through the filter. I've got multiple filters in this system, so let's take the other channel and patch that through a second filter. Actually, listen to this in stereo. So between these two modulation parameters, there's a wide range of different timbres that are available, from slight phasing, slight detuning between the parallel sawtooth waves, the phase variants, up to much more aggressive detuning. And these are, of course, CV controllable. So let's take an LFO from the oct here, patch that to my rate. take another one, apply that to modulation depth. So now we've got independent fluctuation from the phase variance aligning to a single unison to spreading out with an additional variation to the rate of modulation. So an additional change in comparison to the oct, which can be pulled down to low frequencies and forced to stall if you add further negative CV. The rate parameter on the cruïnn will stall the 5 LFOs. So this means that with the rate down, depth is essentially just moving 5 parallel DC offsets to control the phase. So it means that static, consistent periodic waveforms are available under CV control, or under control via the depth parameter. Then adjusting the rate, bringing in additional offset positions. I'll use a sample and hold step random voltage and apply that to my modulation depth. Some nice rhythmic techniques to the wave shaping. There's actually a similar way to approach this, where if I use a trigger signal, I'll cycle this knock and just use the gate output derived from the attack, which is just a short trigger pulse, and apply that to my rate CV. It's a way of using the 5 LFOs effectively as 5 sample and holds. So whenever there's a amplitude pulse seen from this gate signal, that's causing the modulation to rate to jump up, but only for a short duty cycle. So it's effectively randomizing pull that down just now, and let's patch up more of a melodic patch here. So I'm going to sample an LFO. I'll clock that from here, from another knock. And use the end of cycle trigger, and let's quantize that voltage. Sounding quite melodic. Okay, let's make use of the VCA. I'm going to use this knock as an envelope in addition to using it as the clock for the tie. patch this to the CV input of the VCA. So I've got this envelope in exponential shaping. The VCA on the cruïnn itself is linear response, although the linearity will be slightly variable based on the saturation, soft clipping, so there's not a direct linear mapping there, I guess, but compared to the linear there. There we go. Okay, let's patch up these two 1047 filters to run from a common control. I'll use this Vinca down here, and so I'll use the bipolar offset as my cutoff frequency control. I patch that to both volt per octave jacks. Cool. You can use this same envelope that's controlling the VCA and use that for the filter as well. That modulator out. That sounded pretty good. Let's go one additional step with this stereo filtering. I'll use the FM inputs, which have got 10 uverters, and I'll offset them in opposite directions and then control them from a common modulator. I'll use this another knock that's set to cycling and just giving me triangle LFO. Slow it down a bit more. And at the turn of a knob with the depth control, you can pull things really tightly to being dual mono. Bring up the depth, that's essentially adding spread to the stereo width. Find to be quite a nice touch is if we do an equivalent to, what would be key tracking on a keyboard synth. I'll use just one of the other CV outputs of the harmony here, and I'm going to patch that to exponential FM. No, not exponential FM. Sorry, the rate. That's what I found. If I keep it static pitch at the moment, this is a nice sweet spot for bass frequencies, But then bring the rate up too high and you start to get a bit more warble to it. You lose tightness of the monophonic note. But then as you go to higher frequencies, the phase modulation becomes a lot less aggressive. So higher rate of modulation matching to higher frequency can sound a bit more natural. Which makes sense as fundamental frequencies get higher, the spacing between harmonic overtone spacing increases exponentially. So what sounds like a nice degree of phase shift at lower frequencies will be much more subtle at higher frequencies. So by doing this, by just patching a CV to both rate and volt per octave, you can dial in a nice degree of natural, consistent phase shifting. Stereo width. What's actually happening here with the envelope controlling the VCA? I've got the VCA open quite high, meaning that the envelope striking that is pushing the amplitude a bit further, so it's going to be further overdriving the VCA. So you get a bit of extra saturation in there before it hits the filter. Another modulation signal. Add another triangle LFO, and I'll match that to depth. Back to one more variation, and I'm going to keep depths up and reduce rate. And I'm going to use that LFO sample and hold trick where I'll use the gate output from, actually I could use it from my primary clocking knock. See, every time a clock fires here over the rate control, we're sample and holding the rate. So every new pluck, we're getting a new phase offset per phase variant. Compare that to being static dual mono. next up, I'm going to show a patch example using the cruïnn and LFO ranges to essentially use this as a stochastic clock, is maybe a somewhat appropriate term. I'm going to use 1047, so 3 resonant filters, and use the various outputs to ping the filters. So this could be done equally as well using the expander outputs for the parallel outputs to then use them as clock sources for various modules, but I'm going to make use of the actual summed outputs from the cruïnn. So let me patch up my audible voice first. It's going to be coming from these 3 filters. I'm going to control them from the harmony, so I've got some harmonic element to it. Set that into calibration mode. So I'll use this first 1047 as my root, then use this as third, and this one as my fifth, and just create a harmonic triad between the 3. And for patching, I'm going to use a couple of 1Fs as crossfaders to create a monosum of my root. So root will be going to both left and right, and then have third and fifth on left and right individually. So let's patch this there. Need to be multed to both channels, then left and right. And let's kick all these into self-oscillation. And let's hear it. Left and right. I'm going to tune all 3 fundamentals to this pitch. Oscillation off, and I'm going to use my sigma output, so that's the sum of all 6 sawtooth waves. I'll use that to ping my root. Left and right to go to my other filters. There you go. So we can see the rate of the LFO for reference of the timing. There are ghost notes almost, because there's some slight artifacts and pipe and spikes that occur on the phase variants. Negligible on this rate, but it's enough to cause some pinging on the filters. That's quite nice. hear the offset pattern. So with depth all the way down, we've got perfect alignment of all the 6 sawtooth phase variants. As I bring up the depth, I'm pushing offsets to shift the phase of the 5 variants. So it means that wherever the LFOs have stalled, that determines the rhythmic deviation per cycle. So it's periodic clocking, but with variations in the offset and syncopation between them. So here's an interesting patch example where I'm going to use the cruïnn in LFO ranges and use the parallel outputs from the expander to modulate aspects of a separate synth voice in parallel. So I'm gonna patch up a voice using the Gnoni sawtooth output through a 1047 filter, and then use the cruïnn as my control. Traditional. There we are. So timbre controls, I'm using the sawtooth output. I can use the sawtooth split to change the overtone accentuation, cutoff frequency. I'll use things like resonance to mix in a parallel input. So let's take the wave folder output, put that to the inverted input. That's cool. Okay, let's patch up some control. I'm going to quantize the fundamental ramp and use that to create a repeating melodic arpeggio. What I'll do, let's view each of these. I'll just use the oscilloscope to show my main modulation signal. Okay, let's start patching some voice control. So I'm going to use the sawtooth split control. So now as the ramp starts, everything's in phase, so the second sawtooth I'll show in blue. So the blue voice is my variation from fundamental saw through to the split octave up. Without that CV, it's classic sawtooth. If I patch this in, we get that ducking of the lowest harmonic. And now I've brought up the depth. I've now created an offset between the timing of that. Next up, let's control the cutoff frequency. There we go. So we can now see on the blue, red and yellow channels, as I bring up the LFO rates, we're starting to get more than just the parallel phase shifted sawtooths. But at any time I can pull the depth down and align everything to being parallel modulation. So let's go a step further and keep things very much on topic. I'll modify this patch to make it fundamentally stereo. So I'll send both these oscillator signals, sawtooth and the wave folder, to a second 1047. To create some deviation, I'll use different... I've got two more LFO outputs, so I can use them. And I'll now patch this to my right channel. So I've changed this modulation signal at the Nyoni to being the wavefold depth. So what's happening now, I've brought the fundamental sawtooth down to its lowest frequency, so we can see the green trace is my very slow fundamental ramp, and then any of the additional signals that we've got scoped on channels 2, 3 and 4, they're artifacts of the triangle LFOs coming through with their own global DC offset of the fundamental ramp. So it's a combination of phase modulation and wave shaping over this LFO ramp in parallel. Then at any time I can pull the depth down and consolidate everything down to a single global shift. And then here I've stalled the LFOs. I've got a nice range of some positive, some negative. So as I increase the depth, I'm shifting the phase of the parallel sawtooth waves. So some are wrapping around, some are just deviating away from the center. So this can be quite nice to externally modulate itself. I'll take an LFO from the oct here, apply that to modulation depth. Better still, let's use a cycling knock as a triangle wave. Offset it so it's a ramp, and I'm going to derive a trigger signal from this attack phase. Use that to clock my rate parameter. So I'm using this as almost 5 parallel sample and holds, while the overall ramp is shifting and changing the rate of modulation, or the depth of modulation. Drop that down to more of a bass territory. Add a bit of vibrato. So in this case, maximum depth, low rate, lowest fundamental, and I've got 5 parallel LFOs that are controlling these parameters. But then for extra degrees of control, I can use modulation to open up the depth, and also clocks or other external modulation to progress the deviation in phase. This is now a static rate, and I'm using the frequency of the fundamental LFO ramp as my main timed element. That's all phases aligned of the parallel outputs. It's almost like quadrature LFOs, but with dynamically variable phase relationships. So yeah, cruïnn in LFO mode, complex modulation source. Okay, let's dive into some more advanced wave shaping techniques using the cruïnn as a stereo complex wave shape oscillator. The way of doing this is using a secondary oscillator as essentially a modulation source, but there's some particular quirks you can get away with using the Untitled in particular, taking advantage of its through zero frequency modulation capability. But this will work equally as well with any oscillator that has hard sync capabilities. So I think it'll be best if I sort of demonstrate the wave shaping techniques that are occurring, just so that it's clear what's going on. Set this to, there we go, traditional mode, and this is just a triangle wave from the Untitled. Sounds like that. I'm going to control the amplitude of that via a 1F, just for demonstration purposes, like that. And this I'm going to use as my modulation control over the first phase variant on the cruïnn. I'll patch this into channel 1. What I'll do is I'm going to clock this to there we go. I'll clock this to my fundamental. If I do this and mute that channel visually, let's look at this on the red channel. Here we go. So I'm going to flip the roles temporarily. I'm going to drop the Untitled into LFO rate, and we're now looking at the Untitled on yellow and the cruïnn's phase variant number 1 on red. Now, if I bring up the depth of this triangle, we can see that I'm applying phase modulation to the phase of this sawtooth phase variant. So if we view that in combination to my original static one, which is on yellow, then the red one is shifting based on the modulation rate of the Untitled. So let's listen to that for reference. So this is green static on left and red phase shifting on right. Just with a sine wave then. Should be able to hear that quite clearly. So fundamentally this is what the cruïnn's designed to do, but using its own internal LFOs to shift the phase. So if I pull this out, I can then bring up the depth and we get that same result from the internal triangle LFOs. But where things get interesting, I'll bring this down, we'll listen to only the red phase shifting version. As I bring it up in frequency, it's a form of frequency modulation where we now have this as sine wave modulator and sawtooth carrier, and the phase is shifting, or the frequency shifting around it. Although it's not technically frequency modulation, it's phase modulation because it's shifting the phase in relation to the fundamental. And if I find a ratio that these settle, we can see our modulation sine wave and the resulting waveform that's coming through, which is this, looks like wave folding. So what I'll do to accentuate this further, I'm going to drop my cruïnn down to LFO ranges. I'll clock the scope from channel 4, which is my original sine wave. Maybe change over to a triangle just so we've got some clear peak definitions. There we go. So I'm now using through zero phase modulation of the cruïnn's first phase variant, which is phase shifting the slowest ramp the cruïnn's capable of producing. It'll maybe go lower if you add negative CV. But it shouldn't ever stall. It should always have some minimum rate, even if that is ridiculously slow LFO territory. We then have this audible triangle wave, which is visible before it goes through the cruïnn on yellow. And you can see the DC offset's just pushing up and it's wrapping around as the fundamental sawtooth amplitude wraps round. So that's where this wave folding element comes in. And if I increase the depth of modulation, we start to get these extra peaks coming through. So it folds a couple of times. So I'm using this as a wave folder now, essentially. So let's make things a bit more interesting. I'll use the wave folder output of my Nyoni. I'll run that through a second 1F to give me control over amplitude. And let's run that through an additional channel. Here we go. So I'll come from this output and we'll listen to this on the opposite channel. So now it's my folded triangle. And there's my folded wave folder source, which is occurring through the second phase variant. And this one, because it's a wave folder, I can wavefold the wave folded signal. So I've now got two discrete wave folded signals using two phase variant channels of the cruïnn. You can hear there's an overall gradual shift in timbre because the ramp is always going to be going on the cruïnn at a certain rate. So I could bring that up to a higher LFO range and I've got this constant cycling movement of timbre. But if I want this to be almost like a softer modulation, if I keep that static and bring up the depth and rate of phase modulation via the cruïnn's phase modulation controls, I'm now using these two upper LED depictions of triangle waves that are moving the amplitude, or moving the phase of the sawtooth variants that are being audio rate phase modulated by the two signals from this Nyoni. A lot going on, but I'll simplify as we go. And what's quite nice is you can land on fairly static repeating waveforms. Again, there's that gradual shift from the cruïnn sawtooth ramping through. But if I have the rate stalled on these LFOs, I've got manual control over depth, which is changing the fold symmetry. Cool. So quite aggressive folding because it's like really sharp edges. But let's tweak this a bit further and see what else we can get from this. I'll pull these 1F attenuators out just now. They might come back into play in a bit. So I'm going to actually use the stereo outputs of my cruïnn as my stereo source. There we go. I'll use the fundamental square of my gnoni just now as clock source. There we go. So now if I bring this up, this is just listening to the raw cruïnn voice. We're going to keep that in LFO range so that it's just a steadily moving DC offset. And let's pick two waveform sources from the gnoni. Let's go triangle wave, put that there. So you can see it looks quite different from the direct output, which is very pointy, very jagged. Viewing it here, this is wave shaped because we've got soft clipping applied at the VCA stage. Let's go, let's triangle wave. Let's use the sawtooth wave. I'm going to patch this to this input. The 6 outputs, we've got fundamental unphase shifted and then 2 phase variants. We've then got the slower phase variant and then 2 additional phase variants. So that's the top output and the bottom output, so right and left. So I've now got this one to one channel and this to another channel. Well, what we're seeing and hearing is this big dramatic shifting DC offset. So this is coming from the fundamental sawtooth ramp from the cruïnn. I've got depth all the way down, so all 6 sawtooths are ramping in unison, in parallel, in phase. And we've got these 2 audio signals patched through. So this is what we're hearing without the gnoni voices patched in. So we're actually hearing 2 voices, one for left, one for right, and then there are 2 additional LFO sawtooth ramps per channel. So that's why we're getting this weird DC offset shift. So the way to get round that is to just throw more signals at our voices. This wavefolder output and send that to both channels together. So now, because I'm using 5 CV signals, we've just got this single creeping up DC offset. That's from the original. Patch that to channel 2, so we should see this as an ascending ramp. And So we can still hear it happening, and there's a bit of a jump going on. But there's a lot more consistency in terms of static waveforms. Like there's this gradual shift because of the LFO, but which we can use to our advantage. Swap these around. That should ensure the wave filters go into both sides. Yeah, there we go. So see, as I adjust the depth with the rate stalled, this is the same as on the traditional cruïnn setup, where as I bring up the depth, it's shifting, scattering the phases of the phase variance. But in this case, it's shifting variable DC offsets to each phase variance audio input signal. So we end up with static wave shaping, which we could use as a variable timbre technique. I'll clock a sample and hold, patch that to depth. That's me slewed the sample and hold, adding a bit of deviation to the timbre. Or of course I could use the depth as a static parameter and increase the rate of the variable LFOs. So I've now got 5 LFOs controlling the symmetry offset of the folding of these 5 parallel voices coming from the Nyoni. Or 4, I'm using the square wave just as the clock, but the square wave could validly be used on one of those channels. I'm doubling up the wave folder to give me some consistency between the left and right. Okay, let's add an additional variation to this, where I'm going to make use of the through zero frequency modulation capability of the Nyoni. So I'm bringing that to through zero now. There's no FM signal, but I'm going to use I'm now using the fundamental sawtooth of the cruïnn into the FM input with the Nyoni and through zero frequency modulation. So this is now looking for the FM source to be my fundamental frequency. So it means I need to kick this into audio rate. I need to clock my scope from channel 2 now. That to channel 1, just because the greens are easier to see. There we go. So if I bring my carrier frequency, which is the through zero Nyoni, all the way down, then what we're seeing is the sort of classic cruïnn phasing super saw voice. Move these down so we can see left versus right, or right versus left, whichever way you're wearing your headphones. There we go. So now if I bring my rate down, I'm back to the capability of the cruïnn to hold on a static wave shape. The one detail I have lost is bringing the depth all the way down doesn't phase align all sawtooth phase variants directly, because each of these outputs is now acting like a static DC offset. But that's fine, because the layered up sawtooths isn't the most useful voice, because it's just a static saw, or saturated sawtooth. Where things get musical is if we have a degree of modulation depth and rate. Now for added timbre control, I bring up my through zero FM index ratio. And it's acting as a complex wave shaper, which is applied in stereo with different wave shapes per left and right. So between the through zero FM index ratio and wavefold amount, I'm getting some pretty intense timbres. I think what's really cool is the ability to lock these into static wave shapes. There's something almost wavetable-like the sort of shapes that you get morphing through. It's quite reminiscent of a lot of example wavetables. But the fact that it then locks into something being very static is interesting. Again, this is 100% analog, so it's no relation to wavetable beyond some sonic similarities in certain contexts. Okay, so I believe this is hard syncing at this time. Taking the link switch off, so this is now a more naturally shifting through zero FM configuration, where there will be a natural degree of fluctuation and movement depending on the depth of through zero frequency modulation and index ratio. So there's some nice spots where it'll land, but in that typical through zero FM way, it's got some organic movement to it, which can be enhanced via the built-in LFOs of the cruïnn, or locked to being more static. And then if I want absolute rigidity, then engage hard sync. And in this case on the Nyoni, that switch engaged, it's using the edge detection, or the zero crossings from negative to positive of the modulation input, which in this case is the sawtooth signal, after it's been AC coupled, because this is natively unipolar positive. So that's used to phase align by hard sync, in addition to frequency modulation through zero with wavefolding. Yeah, a lot going on, but it boils down to several parameters that give you a wide array of timbre offsets. Let's build up this patch a bit more so that it's a bit more performative. Use a cycling knock as my clock source. Clock sample and hold. Undersample a triangle wave. quantize that. So I can go from a more classic static super saw, dynamically variable super saw with using phase variation to make it sound like it's layered sawtooths. Let's make that static again, and then bringing up my through 0 FM depth. I get some much more complex wave shaping. The last edition, the wave folder adds extra splits in there as well. And because of the built-in limiter, the amplitude will always be restricted in and it will never hard clip. Okay, and let's build up some stereo filtering into this. So I've now got quantized sample and hold for the melodic element, which will invoke per octave. I can use this envelope here as my VCA control. Then I want to add some parallel filtering to this. So I'm going to use a trick here where I'll come from my main outputs, left and right. So let's use red as left, yellow as right. I'm going to patch these through a filter each. Come out of the low pass outputs. Let's go band pass. Band pass from each, left and right. I'm going to use these at first as attenuators via the 1F. So that's unattenuated. And then this will be going to my actual left and right output. Let's go. So that's discrete bandpass filtering over left and right. A bit of resonance. Nice. Okay, here's the next trick. I'm going to use the sigma output of the cruïnn, which is a sum of both left and right together, and I'm going to low pass filter that through a third filter, and then use the two parallel 1Fs as crossfaders. So I'll be combining a mono element that's a common low-pass filtered or parallel low-pass filtered sum of left and right, and sum that in to a degree with these two discretely bandpass filtered left and right channels. So this sort of patch does require a larger system with a good few filters in it, but yeah, stereo patching is very in right now. I think there's going to be more to come with regards to stereo patching. Okay, let's go to Joe Mono. common mono signal. And mix that with the 2 bandpass. That's one of the tricks I've found to stereo patching, is retaining a degree of common mono content. It means that there's more contrast between the common center phantom image source and the discrete outer channels. Okay, let's use a couple of modulation signals. I'm going to cascade a couple of knocks here. So I'm using the gate output to trigger the input of the other. Set them both to the gates being derived from the falling edge. And the result being a quadrature triangle pair of LFOs, and both in one-shot mode. Now let's use these as 2 parallel modulation sources. I'll use the bipolar outputs. So I've got bipolar signal throughput, and patch this to the FM. Slow the whole thing down a bit. Do one more change. And to control the volt per octaves of all 3 filters in parallel, from this Vinca down here. same envelope I'm using for the VCA to control these filters. starting to sound quite like physical modelling. A bit of Carpenter Strong type vibes. Change these modulation sources to just random LFOs. So yeah, that's some complex stereo wave shaping using the cruïnn. Hope you enjoy.